The guard stationed outside Prince Carlos's chambers in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid had heard many things during their years of service. The whispered conspiracies of courtiers, the hurried footsteps of messengers bearing news of distant battles, the occasional outburst from temperamental nobles. But nothing had prepared them for what they witnessed during those final hellish months of 1568. Behind the heavy oak doors, reinforced with iron and sealed by royal decree, came sounds that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Not the measured protests of a political prisoner or the resigned sighs of house arrest, but something far more sinister, the gradual, agonizing disintegration of a human soul trapped in its own flesh. Prince Carlos of Spain, heir to the most powerful empire the world had ever known, was dying by degrees. And his own father, King Philip II, held the key to his prison. This is not merely the story of a prince's death, but a tale of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, how paranoia can consume even the bonds of blood, and how the pursuit of political stability can justify the most unthinkable cruelties. It is the story of a young man whose only crime may have been existing at the wrong time, in the wrong family, with the wrong king for a father. Carlos de Austria was born on July 8, 1545, into a world that expected greatness from him before he drew his first breath. As the son of Philip II of Spain and Maria Manuela of Portugal, he carried the weight of two crowns and the hopes of an empire that stretched from the Philippines to Peru. But from the very beginning, fate seemed determined to mark him as different, dangerous, perhaps even cursed. The circumstances of his birth foreshadowed the tragedy to come. His mother, Maria Manuela, died just 4 days after bringing him into the world, her young body unable to survive the complications of childbirth. Carlos would grow up motherless, raised by a succession of tutors and courtiers in the cold, formal atmosphere of the Spanish court, where every word was measured and every gesture scrutinized for signs of weakness or rebellion. Philip II was not a father in any sense that modern minds would recognize. The king was a man consumed by duty, by the overwhelming responsibility of governing an empire where the sun never set. He viewed his son not as a beloved child to be nurtured, but as a future king to be molded, shaped, and if necessary, broken on the anvil of royal necessity. From his earliest years, Carlos displayed troubling signs. He was physically frail, with a pronounced limp that made him the target of courtly whispers. More disturbing were the reports of his behavior, violent outbursts that seemed to come from nowhere, moments of cruelty toward servants and animals that shocked even the hardened nobles of Philip's court. Was this the natural result of a lonely, motherless childhood spent under the cold gaze of a distant father? Or were these early warning signs of something darker, more fundamental? The question would torment Philip II for years, and ultimately lead him to make a decision that would damn him in the eyes of history. By the time Carlos reached adolescence, the reports had become impossible to ignore. He had allegedly thrown a servant down a flight of stairs for bringing him the wrong meal. He had tortured small animals with a methodical cruelty that chilled observers. Most disturbing of all, he had begun to speak openly of his hatred for his father and his desire to see Philip's enemies triumph over Spain. But were these the actions of a genuinely disturbed mind, or the desperate rebellion of a young man suffocated by impossible expectations and isolated from any genuine human connection? The answer would depend entirely on who was asked, and whether they dared to speak honestly about the heir to the Spanish throne. The trajectory of Carlos's life, and his ultimate fate, was sealed by a single moment of youthful recklessness on the stone stairs of the University of Alcalá de Henares. It was 1562, and the 17-year-old prince was pursuing his studies, or rather, pursuing the serving girls who caught his eye in the university corridors. On that fateful day, Carlos was chasing after a particularly attractive young woman when disaster struck. Whether distracted by lust or simply careless in his eagerness, He missed a step and tumbled headfirst down the stone staircase. His skull cracked against the unforgiving stone with a sound that witnesses would later describe as resembling a melon being split with an axe. The prince lay unconscious for hours, blood pooling beneath his head as the finest physicians in Spain were summoned to save the heir to the throne. What followed was a medical nightmare that pushed 16th-century medicine to its absolute limits. The royal doctors tried everything: bloodletting, herbal poultices, even trepanation, drilling holes in the prince's skull to relieve the pressure on his brain. In desperation, they even resorted to what can only be described as medieval superstition. The body of Diego de Alcala, a Franciscan friar who had been beatified just years earlier, was brought to Carlos's bedside. The mummified remains were placed next to the unconscious prince in the hope that divine intervention might succeed where medical science had failed. Miraculously, or perhaps simply due to the resilience of youth, Carlos survived. But the young man who awakened from that coma was fundamentally changed. The head injury had affected not just his physical appearance, leaving him with a permanently deformed skull and worsened limp, but seemed to have unleashed something dark and uncontrollable within his mind. The reports that followed painted a picture of a personality transformed beyond recognition. Where Carlos had once been merely difficult, he now became actively dangerous. His violent outbursts increased in both frequency and severity. He developed an obsession with torture devices, spending hours examining instruments of pain with the focused attention that other young nobles might devote to swords or horses. Most alarming of all, he began to speak openly of his political ambitions, not to inherit Spain peacefully, but to actively work against his father's interests. He spoke of fleeing to the Netherlands, where Protestant rebels were fighting Spanish rule. He hinted at alliances with France, Spain's greatest enemy. He even suggested that he might be willing to convert to Protestantism if it would help him gain power. Were these the ravings of a brain-damaged young man, or the calculated words of a political rebel? Philip II found himself facing the most terrible dilemma any father could imagine. Was his son mentally ill and in need of treatment, or was he a traitor who posed an existential threat to the Spanish Empire? By 1568, King Philip II of Spain stood at the pinnacle of worldly power, yet found himself faced with a problem that no amount of gold from the Americas or military might from his armies could solve. His son and heir, Carlos, had become not just an embarrassment to the crown, but a genuine threat to the stability of the empire. The reports reaching the king's private chambers painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Carlos had been caught attempting to seduce his own stepmother, Philip's young French wife, Elizabeth of Valois. He had made contact with Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, apparently offering to join their cause against his own father. Most damning of all, he had been overheard by multiple witnesses expressing his desire to see Philip dead, and his hope that Spain's enemies would triumph in their ongoing conflicts. For a lesser man, these might have been dismissed as the foolish words of a troubled youth. But Carlos was not a lesser man. He was the heir to the Spanish throne, the future ruler of the most powerful empire on earth. His words carried weight, his actions had consequences, and his mere existence had become a rallying point for every enemy Spain possessed. Philip faced a choice that would have broken a weaker man. As a king, he had a duty to protect his empire and his subjects from any threat, including those that emerged from within his own family. As a father, he was bound by ties of blood and, presumably, love to protect and nurture his child. But what happens when those two sacred duties come into direct conflict? What does a man do when his son becomes his greatest enemy? When paternal love becomes a luxury that an empire cannot afford? The king's advisors were unanimous in their recommendation. Carlos must be neutralized. Some suggested exile, banishing the prince to a remote monastery where he could live out his days in obscurity. Others, more ruthless in their calculations, hinted at permanent solutions that would ensure Carlos could never threaten the throne again. Philip chose a path that was perhaps more cruel than either extreme. On January 18, 1568, he made the decision that would define the remainder of his reign and stain his reputation for centuries to come. Carlos would be placed under house arrest in his own chambers, cut off from all outside contact, and left to contemplate his crimes in isolation. It was presented as a merciful solution. The prince would be spared execution or exile, but would be prevented from causing further harm to the state. In reality, it was the beginning of a psychological torture that would slowly destroy what remained of Carlos's already fragmented mind. The chambers that became Prince Carlos's final prison were a cruel mockery of royal luxury. Located in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, they were appointed with the finest furnishings that Spanish wealth could provide. Tapestries woven with golden thread, furniture crafted from rare woods, windows that looked out onto manicured gardens where the prince would never again walk freely. But no amount of material comfort could disguise the reality of what these rooms had become. A cage designed to hold a man who had once been destined to rule the world. The conditions of Carlos's imprisonment were carefully designed to break his spirit while maintaining the fiction that he was simply under protective custody. He was allowed no visitors except for a handful of carefully selected servants and guards, all of whom had been instructed to report his every word and action back to the king. His meals were brought to him on silver plates, but he was forbidden from leaving his chambers for any reason. Most cruelly of all, he could see and hear the life of the court continuing without him. Through his windows, he could watch courtiers strolling through the gardens, conducting the business of empire while he rotted in luxurious isolation. The sounds of music and laughter from royal celebrations drifted through his walls, constant reminders of the world that had been taken from him. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Carlos, already unstable from his head injury and years of conflict with his father, began to deteriorate rapidly under the pressure of total isolation. The guards reported increasingly erratic behavior, hours spent pacing his chambers like a caged animal, violent outbursts directed at furniture when no human targets were available, long periods of catatonic silence broken only by sudden fits of weeping. He began to refuse food, not out of any calculated hunger strike, but from a growing disconnection from basic human needs. The prince who had once been notorious for his appetite now pushed away even the most carefully prepared delicacies, existing on little more than bread and water. Sleep became elusive, then impossible. The guards reported seeing lights burning in his chambers throughout the night, hearing him talking to himself or arguing with invisible enemies. When exhaustion finally claimed him, his rest was plagued by nightmares that left him screaming in terror, calling out for a mother he had never known and a father who had abandoned him to this gilded hell. The physical symptoms followed quickly. His already frail constitution, weakened by poor diet and lack of sleep, began to fail. His skin took on a waxy pallor, his hair began to fall out in clumps, and his eyes developed the hollow, haunted look of a man staring into an abyss that only he could see. Yet through it all, Philip maintained the charade that this was necessary for the good of the empire, that his son was simply being protected from his own dangerous impulses. The king continued to receive daily reports on Carlos's condition, reading each account of his son's deterioration with the cold analysis he might apply to dispatches from a distant battlefield. As the months of imprisonment stretched on, Prince Carlos's grip on reality began to slip away like sand through desperate fingers. The young man who had once commanded the attention of courtiers and foreign ambassadors now found himself alone with nothing but his own tormented thoughts for company. The transformation was both gradual and shocking to witness. Guards reported conversations with invisible visitors, elaborate debates with enemies who existed only in Carlos's increasingly fractured mind. He would spend hours preparing for audiences with important dignitaries who would never come, dressing in his finest clothes and practicing speeches for ears that would never hear them. His obsession with his father became the central focus of his deteriorating mental state. Carlos would alternate between expressing desperate love for Philip, begging imaginary visitors to carry messages of reconciliation to the king, and unleashing torrents of hatred that shocked even his hardened guards. He spoke of elaborate revenge fantasies, of scenarios where he would escape his prison and claim his rightful place on the throne, ruling over an empire where his father had been forgotten. The physical symptoms of his mental collapse became impossible to ignore. His refusal to eat regularly led to dramatic weight loss, his once soft royal features becoming gaunt and skeletal. His personal hygiene deteriorated as he lost interest in maintaining the appearances that had been drilled into him since childhood. The prince who had once been obsessive about his clothing and appearance now wore the same garments for days at a time, seemingly unaware of his own degradation. More disturbing were the reports of self-harm. Guards discovered scratches and bruises on Carlos's arms and face that could only have been self-inflicted. He had begun to bang his head against the walls during his worst episodes, reopening wounds from his childhood accident and causing fresh injuries that refused to heal properly. His sleep schedule became completely inverted. Carlos would remain awake for days at a time, his eyes red and staring, before collapsing into periods of unconsciousness that lasted for 12 to 18 hours. Even during these brief respites, he found no peace. His dreams were filled with nightmares that left him screaming and thrashing, often waking the entire wing of the palace with his cries. The servants assigned to care for him began requesting transfers, unable to bear witness to his steady deterioration. Those who remained spoke in whispers of the prince's condition, crossing themselves when they thought no one was watching and muttering prayers for a young man who seemed to have been abandoned by both his earthly father and his heavenly one. Yet still Philip made no move to end his son's suffering. The king had committed himself to this course of action and seemed determined to see it through to its inevitable conclusion, no matter the cost to his own conscience or his son's sanity. By the summer of 1568, Prince Carlos had become a ghost haunting his own palace. 6 months of imprisonment had transformed the once robust young man into a skeletal figure who bore little resemblance to the prince who had entered those chambers in January. His condition had deteriorated to the point where even his most loyal servants struggled to recognize the heir to the Spanish throne in the hollow-eyed specter he had become. The reports reaching King Philip became increasingly desperate in tone. The royal physician, Dr. Oliveras, filed daily updates that read like battlefield dispatches from a losing war. The prince's weight had dropped to dangerous levels, his refusal to eat having become almost complete. Water was now his primary sustenance, and even that was consumed irregularly and often regurgitated within hours. His mental state had progressed beyond simple madness into something that seemed almost supernatural in its horror. Carlos spent entire days lying motionless on his bed, staring at the ceiling with eyes that seemed to see through the material world into some realm of private torment. When he did speak, his words were often incomprehensible, a mixture of Latin prayers learned in childhood, Spanish curses directed at unseen enemies, and Portuguese lullabies that might have been remembered from his brief time with his dying mother. The physical symptoms had become grotesque. His skin, stretched tight over prominent bones, had taken on a yellowish tinge that suggested organ failure. His hair, once thick and dark like his father's, had become brittle and sparse, falling out in patches that left irregular bald spots across his scalp. Most disturbing of all were his eyes, once bright with intelligence and anger. They had become dull and clouded, like those of a corpse that had not yet realized it was dead. Dr. Oliveras' reports during this period make for harrowing reading. The physician documented seizures that left the prince unconscious for hours, periods of violent thrashing that required multiple guards to prevent him from injuring himself, and episodes of what appeared to be complete catatonia where Carlos would remain motionless for days at a time, giving no response to external stimuli. The smell of death had begun to permeate the chambers. Despite the efforts of servants to maintain cleanliness, Carlos's deteriorating condition created an atmosphere of decay that seemed to seep into the very walls. Guards reported that they could detect the odor of illness and despair from several rooms away, a sickly sweet scent that reminded them of battlefields after a siege. Yet still, incredibly, Prince Philip maintained the fiction that this was all necessary for the good of the empire. Even as reports reached him of his son's approaching death, the king refused to relent. He had made his choice, and he would see it through to its bitter conclusion, regardless of the cost to his own soul or his family's legacy. On July 24, 1568, exactly 6 months after his imprisonment began, Prince Carlos of Spain drew his last breath in the same chambers where he had slowly wasted away. He was 23 years old, and with his death, the direct line of succession to the Spanish throne died with him. The official cause of death, as recorded by the royal physicians, was listed as natural causes resulting from a prolonged illness. But everyone who had witnessed the prince's final months knew the truth. Carlos had been murdered as surely as if his father had wielded the knife himself. The weapon had not been steel or poison, but something far more insidious: isolation, neglect, and the slow, methodical destruction of a young man's will to live. The discovery of his body was left to his longtime valet, a man named Francisco who had served the prince since childhood. What he found in those chambers was barely recognizable as the young man he had once known. Carlos lay on his bed, his body so emaciated that he seemed to be little more than skin stretched over bone. His face, frozen in death, bore an expression of such profound despair that Francisco later claimed he could never forget it, that it haunted his dreams until his own death decades later. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was found clutched in the prince's skeletal fingers: a miniature portrait of his mother, Maria Manuela, the woman he had never truly known but had apparently thought of in his final moments. The painting, worn smooth by handling, suggested that Carlos had spent his last days holding on to the only connection he had ever felt to unconditional love. The news of the prince's death spread through the palace like wildfire, but the official reaction was carefully orchestrated to maintain the fiction that this had been a natural tragedy rather than a calculated execution. Philip II announced his son's death with the same formal reserve he might use to report the outcome of a minor military campaign, expressing regret at the loss while emphasizing that the prince had been ill for some time. Privately, however, the impact on the king was profound. Those close to Philip reported that he seemed to age years in the space of days following Carlos's death, his hair becoming noticeably grayer and his bearing taking on a weight that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. He had achieved his goal. The threat to his throne had been eliminated, but the victory had come at a price that would torment him for the remainder of his reign. The burial of Prince Carlos was conducted with all the pomp and ceremony befitting an heir to the Spanish throne, but it could not disguise the fundamental tragedy of what had occurred. A young man who should have inherited the greatest empire in the world had instead died alone, abandoned by his father and betrayed by the system that should have protected him. In the days and weeks following Prince Carlos's death, King Philip II and his advisors worked methodically to craft a narrative that would protect the monarchy from the devastating truth of what had actually occurred. The official story was carefully constructed to portray the prince's death as a tragedy rather than a crime, a sad but inevitable result of his mental illness rather than the direct consequence of his father's calculated cruelty. Court physicians were instructed to emphasize Carlos's history of erratic behavior and his injuries from the childhood accident, painting a picture of a young man whose mind had been damaged beyond repair. They spoke of his hereditary melancholy, a condition supposedly inherited from his Portuguese mother's family, and his inability to fulfill the demanding role of heir to such a vast empire. The official autopsy report, conducted by Dr. Oliveris under strict royal supervision, carefully omitted any mention of malnutrition, neglect, or the physical evidence of self-harm that had marked Carlos's final months. Instead, it focused on pre-existing conditions and theoretical weaknesses that might have contributed to his decline, creating a medical fiction that absolved the king of any responsibility for his son's fate. Foreign ambassadors, who had been curious about the prince's sudden disappearance from court life, were given carefully crafted explanations about his need for rest and medical treatment. When news of his death reached foreign courts, it was accompanied by detailed accounts of his mental instability and violent tendencies, designed to make his demise seem not only inevitable but perhaps even fortunate for the stability of Europe. The Spanish Inquisition, always ready to serve the crown's interests, helped spread rumors about Carlos's supposed heretical tendencies and his alleged contacts with Protestant enemies of the faith. These stories served a dual purpose. They provided additional justification for his imprisonment while deflecting attention from the more uncomfortable questions about how a healthy young man could die so suddenly while under his father's protection. Most insidiously, the court historians began the process of rewriting Carlos's life story to fit the official narrative. His childhood difficulties were exaggerated, his academic struggles were emphasized, and his political opinions were characterized as the ravings of a disturbed mind rather than the legitimate grievances of a prince who felt excluded from his rightful inheritance. This campaign of historical revision was remarkably successful. For centuries, the accepted version of Carlos's story portrayed him as a tragic figure whose mental illness made his early death inevitable, if not merciful. Only in recent decades have historians begun to piece together the true story of what occurred in those chambers, examining the contemporary accounts that escaped the royal censorship and revealing the calculated nature of Philip's actions. The cover-up was so thorough that it nearly succeeded in burying the truth forever, transforming one of history's most callous acts of filicide into a sad but understandable family tragedy. The death of Prince Carlos sent shockwaves through the political landscape of 16th-century Europe, though the true cause of those reverberations was hidden beneath layers of official deception. Without an heir, Philip II faced the prospect of a succession crisis that would potentially destabilize the largest empire the world had ever known, and his enemies were quick to recognize the opportunity this presented. In the Netherlands, Protestant rebels who had been fighting Spanish rule seized upon the news as proof of Philip's tyrannical nature. They spread their own version of Carlos's story, portraying him as a sympathetic figure who had died because of his opposition to his father's oppressive policies. While their account was no more accurate than the official Spanish version, it served their propaganda purposes perfectly, helping to rally support for their continued resistance. France, Spain's traditional enemy, also saw opportunity in the tragedy. Rumors began to circulate in French courts that Carlos had been murdered specifically because he had been sympathetic to French interests and had opposed his father's aggressive foreign policy. These stories, whether true or not, helped to further damage Philip's reputation among the European nobility and provided justification for continued French opposition to Spanish expansion. Perhaps most significantly, the death of his only legitimate male heir forced Philip to confront the possibility that his empire might not survive him intact. This realization drove many of his policy decisions in the decades that followed, including his increased reliance on military force to maintain control over his territories and his growing obsession with finding a suitable heir from among his extended family. The psychological impact on Philip himself cannot be underestimated. Those who knew him well reported a marked change in his demeanor following Carlos's death, a darkness that seemed to settle over him like a permanent shadow. He became more suspicious, more controlling, and more willing to use extreme measures against anyone he perceived as a threat to his authority. The king's relationship with his remaining children was forever altered by what had occurred. His daughters found themselves under increased scrutiny, their every action monitored for signs of disloyalty or rebellion. When Philip eventually remarried and had more children, those relationships were marked by a distance and formality that suggested he could never again allow himself to become emotionally vulnerable to potential betrayal. The courtiers and nobles who had witnessed Carlos's slow deterioration were left to grapple with their own complicity in what had occurred. Many had remained silent while a young man suffered and died, choosing loyalty to the crown over basic human decency. The psychological burden of this collective guilt would haunt the Spanish court for years to come, contributing to an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that would characterize Philip's later reign. Modern historians, armed with documents and accounts that were suppressed or ignored for centuries, have reached a very different conclusion about the death of Prince Carlos than the one promoted by his father's propaganda machine. The evidence, when examined objectively, paints a clear picture of what occurred in those chambers during the first half of 1568, the systematic psychological and physical destruction of a young man by his own father. The medical evidence alone is damning. Contemporary accounts describe a healthy, if troubled, young man who entered his imprisonment weighing approximately 140 pounds and emerged 6 months later as a skeletal figure weighing less than 90 pounds. This degree of weight loss cannot be explained by natural illness or hereditary conditions. It is consistent only with severe malnutrition resulting from prolonged neglect. The psychological evidence is equally compelling. Multiple witnesses described Carlos's mental state as deteriorating rapidly following the beginning of his imprisonment, progressing from difficulty and anger to complete psychological collapse. This pattern is entirely consistent with what modern psychology recognizes as the effects of solitary confinement and systematic isolation, not with the gradual progression of hereditary mental illness. Perhaps most tellingly, the timing of Carlos's death coincided perfectly with Philip's political needs. The prince died just as his continued existence was becoming increasingly inconvenient for his father's plans, and just after several foreign courts had begun making inquiries about his welfare and potential availability as a marriage partner. The historical verdict is clear. Prince Carlos of Spain was murdered by his father through deliberate neglect, isolation, and psychological torture. What makes this conclusion particularly tragic is that Carlos's supposed crimes, his political opposition, his erratic behavior, his conflicts with royal authority, were largely the predictable result of his upbringing and circumstances rather than evidence of fundamental evil or madness. Philip II chose to sacrifice his own son on the altar of political expediency, calculating that the death of his heir was preferable to the risk of having that heir grow up to challenge his authority. In doing so, he committed not only filicide but also a crime against the institution of monarchy itself, demonstrating that even the most sacred bonds of blood were secondary to the maintenance of power. This historical reassessment has profound implications for our understanding of Philip II and his reign. Rather than the cold but dutiful ruler portrayed in traditional histories, he emerges as a man capable of the most calculating cruelty when his authority was threatened. The empire he built, vast though it was founded not just on military might and economic exploitation, but on a willingness to destroy even his own family when necessary. The story of Prince Carlos of Spain serves as one of history's most chilling examples of how absolute power can corrupt even the most fundamental human relationships. In choosing to murder his own son rather than risk any challenge to his authority, Philip II crossed a line that should have been sacred even to the most ruthless ruler. But this tale is more than just an account of royal brutality. It is a window into the psychology of tyranny itself. Philip's actions reveal how the possession of unlimited power can gradually erode every normal human instinct, transforming love into suspicion, protection into control, and paternity into mere political calculation. The prince who died in those chambers in July 1568 was, by most accounts, a troubled young man whose problems were largely the product of his circumstances rather than his character. Born into a world that demanded perfection while providing no genuine affection, raised by tutors who valued compliance over compassion, and shaped by a father who saw him primarily as a potential threat rather than a beloved child, Carlos never had a real chance at happiness or normalcy. His death represents not just the end of one young man's life, but the corruption of an entire system of government that placed the maintenance of power above every other consideration, including the most basic bonds of human decency. The fact that Philip was able to carry out this act and then cover it up so successfully demonstrates the dangers inherent in any system where one person wields unlimited authority over others. The guards who stood outside those chambers, listening to the slow deterioration of a prince they were sworn to protect, represent all of us who remain silent in the face of injustice when challenging it seems too dangerous or too costly. Their complicity reminds us that tyranny depends not just on the cruelty of those who wield power, but on the passivity of those who allow that cruelty to continue unchallenged. Perhaps most tragically, Carlos's death was ultimately pointless. Philip's empire did not benefit from the elimination of his heir. If anything, it was weakened by the succession crisis that followed. The threats that the king feared from his son were largely imaginary, the products of paranoia rather than genuine danger. A father's love might have accomplished more than a tyrant's cruelty, but Philip II was too consumed by his own power to recognize that possibility. The horrible death of Spain's child prince stands as an eternal warning about the corrupting influence of absolute authority and the price that societies pay when they allow any individual to wield unlimited power over others. In the end, the real victim was not just Carlos, but the very concept of civilized governance itself. Today, as we grapple with our own questions about the limits of authority and the balance between security and freedom, the ghost of Prince Carlos reminds us that no cause, however noble, and no threat, however real, can justify the abandonment of our basic humanity. The chambers where he died may have long since crumbled into dust, but the echoes of his suffering serve as a perpetual reminder of what we lose when we allow power to triumph over compassion, fear to overcome love, and political calculation to replace human decency. In remembering Carlos, we honor not just the memory of one tragic prince, but our own commitment to ensuring that such horrors are never repeated in any time or place where human beings hold power over the lives of others. Final memorial Goya-style composition showing Carlos transformed from victim to symbol. His suffering becomes a beacon warning against the abuse of power. The painting emphasizes remembrance as protection against repetition, rendered with Goya's ultimate moral authority and historical weight.